I knew something was off when the intern asked me where the on button was for the API. Not what the API did, not how to call it, just where the button was. I'd been at Tailwind Dynamics for 10 years. Not in sales, not in strategy, not one of those LinkedIn happy folks with made up titles like Innovation Sherpa. I built the thing. The bones, the nervous system, the organs. They slapped their branding on it like lipstick on a horse, but it was mine. And I kept receipts, 10 years of architecture files, commit logs, version control, notes so detailed they could have doubled as bedtime stories for an obsessive-compulsive AI. But no one noticed. I was the ghost in the server room, the hands behind the keyboard. People assumed the system just worked because it was supposed to. The execs called it mature infrastructure like it aged in a wine cellar, instead of being actively maintained by one woman who hadn't taken a full vacation since Obama was in office. And I didn't complain, not really. I liked building clean, elegant things that never broke, systems that could take a punch. I drank my coffee in the same break room every morning, microwaved, burnt, somehow both too weak and too bitter. Listened to HR talk about culture initiatives while I quietly patched their janky single sign-on system behind the scenes. Nobody saw it. Nobody had to. That was fine by me. Oh, and hey, while you're here, quick pause. About 90% of you listening haven't hit that little subscribe button. If you like watching smug execs get wrecked by a single clause in their own policy, you might want to fix that. And drop a like too. It seriously keeps the team from losing their minds every time YouTube tanks the algorithm. All right, rant over. Back to our regularly scheduled downfall. Anyway, about 2 months before it all went sideways, I started noticing small things. My name quietly disappeared from a project deck during a quarterly review. The new interns were being onboarded with documentation I hadn't finished editing. Someone was asking around for access to my private repo. My notes repo, the one labeled "Do Not Touch Unless You Enjoy Cleaning Up Digital Blood." Then came the collaboration sessions. See, when you're a senior dev with no title inflation and no buddy-buddy relationship with management, collaboration session means we're taking your project away and giving it to someone with a louder voice and a worse haircut. I played along, smiled during the whiteboard sessions, nodded while the director of product said things like synergize the velocity stack. I kept my mouth shut while they tried to rename functions that had survived 3 CTOs and 2 security audits. I wasn't just getting phased out, I was getting erased, sanitized, like I was a temporary contractor, not the person who had built their entire internal infrastructure during a winter storm on Christmas Eve. While the VP of Ops was on a beach in Maui texting urgent, fix now, and then the new director arrived. God help us all. His name was Bryce. Of course it was. He strolled in wearing a blazer so tight I could see his pulse and teeth so white they probably had their own 401k. Bryce was the kind of man who said crushing it unironically and had a framed MBA on his desk within 14 minutes of arriving. First meeting he led. He brought up Steve Jobs 3 times and said the word disruption like he was personally trademarking it. This place is stuck in 2013, he declared, pacing like he was on a tech stage no one asked for. We're gonna gut the legacy junk and build from scratch. Fast, lean, modular, agnostic. Agnostic? He was talking about back-end frameworks, not theology. I felt my soul leave my body around the 3rd post-it note he slapped on the glass wall. Each one dumber than the last. Innovate, no ego zone, kill tech debt, lol. I introduced myself as the architect behind the company's entire core system, the one bringing in 92% of recurring revenue. He blinked like I'd offered him a fax machine. Cool, he said, already looking past me. We'll phase that out. And just like that, I was vapor. From that day on, every meeting became an endurance test in passive aggression. He talked over me, questioned my timelines, smirked at anything technical like it was a foreign language he didn't need to learn. And I started keeping a tally in my notebook every time he used a word like scalable or pipeline without knowing what it meant. It filled up fast. He called my documentation bloated, said my rollback protocols were paranoid. He wanted agile overkill, whatever that meant. I said, agile without documentation is just a bunch of dudes panicking in Slack. He said, let's circle back on that. I stopped getting invited to roadmap meetings after that. Then the rumors started. HR got real quiet. Finance stopped replying to questions about budget renewals. A Slack channel called Restructure 2025 appeared and disappeared like a glitch. And suddenly, people who had been with the company longer than the plants in the lobby were being transitioned out. It was always the same script: realignment, strategy shift. No fault of your own. Severance packages wrapped in thank you for your contributions like corporate condolences. And Bryce? He just smiled wider. He once called an all-hands meeting just to announce that headcount optimization was a sign of healthy companies. The guy was quoting Jack Welch like it was still 2005. I watched a junior dev cry in the parking lot while he sipped from his stupid monogrammed Yeti and fist-bumped a VP. I wasn't scared yet, not really. I'd seen bad management before. Hell, I'd survived 3 reorgs, 2 product implosions, and 1 CTO who thought encryption was a marketing term. but Bryce was different. He was surgical in his obliviousness, cutting out the soul of the company and calling it progress. So I went quiet, not disengaged, just observant. I kept every email, saved every Slack thread, took screenshots when he contradicted himself or forgot who approved what. Not because I knew what was coming yet, but because I've learned. Men like Bryce burn things down and expect you to thank them for the warmth. And I'd built this place with fireproof gloves. First, it was the DevOps migration. I'd built the original pipeline myself by hand during a 2-week window when our former CTO went AWOL on a digital detox and no one else could even spell Kubernetes. Now, suddenly, it was deemed too legacy. Bryce handed it off to a fresh-out bootcamp hire named Jeremy who once asked me if Bash was short for bashful. I asked if he was serious. He laughed like he wasn't. He was. Then my name vanished from the Q2 deck. Not forgotten, removed. I had personally rewritten the caching logic that saved the company nearly $500,000 last quarter. There were slides about it. Graphs. Bryce presented it as a team effort, which apparently meant his buddy Mason from Stanford took credit while reading off a slide I wrote. I stared at the screen while they all nodded along in the conference room, like this was normal. Like I wasn't sitting right there with the git commits timestamped in my name. I didn't say a word, just wrote the date in my notebook and underlined it twice. That week I got a quick check-in on my calendar from HR. Just a chat, casual. The kind of casual that smells like bleach. I walked in. They offered me a la croix and a seat in the little glass box they call a privacy pod. The HR rep, Kelsey, smiled so wide I thought her cheeks might split. She started talking about career development and alignment with leadership expectations. It felt like someone reading a eulogy while the body was still breathing. They'd heard some concerns about my communication style. Apparently, I was too direct. One exec claimed I made meetings uncomfortable. Another said I was resistant to change. I asked for names. She smiled again and said, "This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about growth." I asked for specifics. She blinked, shuffled some papers, and said something about tone in email threads. When I requested examples, she said the company was focusing on moving forward, not litigating the past. That's when I knew this wasn't feedback, this was prep work. They were laying the tracks for a performance-based dismissal, one they could justify on paper, one that wouldn't trigger my contracts without cause clause. So I did what I always do when I smell a storm coming. I cleaned, not my desk, my history. Pulled every code review I'd written over the past year, archived every design doc, Slack chat, and email chain with approval from stakeholders. I kept the Git trail pristine, timestamped, commented, and mirrored to a private repo. I even screen recorded one of Bryce's strategy sessions where he recommended just using ChatGPT to replace QA. Next came the access changes. My admin privileges were temporarily suspended during the platform audit. No one else's, just mine. When I asked IT, it mumbled something about executive review. I found out later that Mason, presentation thief, and MBA bobblehead had requested access to the data ingestion scripts I wrote last winter, the ones that handled all our client-side telemetry, the ones I had spent 3 weeks debugging while sick with strep. They were gutting me out, piece by piece, and smiling while they did it. But I smiled, too, because I knew something they didn't. 10 years ago, back when we were just a startup with 3 whiteboards and a dream, I wrote the company's first IP policy. It was part of a compliance checklist we needed for a client. Nobody cared about it. Legal skimmed it. The CTO signed it, and buried on page 4 in a clause labeled Section 2B Legacy Systems Ownership in case of termination was a single sentence, dry, boring, and precise. If they were going to push me out, they were going to pay for the privilege, and I was going to make damn sure they read every word. The calendar invite hit at 6:17 p.m. on a Thursday. Subject line, alignment discussion, final review. No agenda, no attachments. Just a 50-minute block sandwiched between 2 meetings labeled confidential. And the attendees? Bryce, Kelsey from HR, and the company lawyer Harold, whose claim to fame was once asking if VPNs were still a thing. I stared at it for a moment, let it sit there like a dead bird on my porch. Then I clicked accept. No reply, no follow-up, not even a Slack ping. That was the tell they weren't expecting pushback. They thought this was a formality. A light tap on the shoulder before security handed me a box and a lanyard with its guts ripped out. I closed my laptop and walked to the back of the server room. Taped under a vent panel, right where the airflow kept it dry but hidden, I pulled out the manila folder I hadn't touched in nearly a decade. The label read, Corp Docs 2014 signed. Yeah, I still use paper. Paper doesn't crash. Paper doesn't forget. Inside was the original IP policy. The one I wrote when the company still thought legal review meant asking someone's cousin who went to paralegal school. We'd needed it for our first federal contract, and no one else wanted to touch it. So I did. I researched. I cross-referenced. I wrote a document so boring it could tranquilize a raccoon. But I added something, just one clause. Section 2B, in the event of termination without cause, intellectual property rights to any proprietary system authored, developed, and maintained solely by the employee shall revert to said employee, unless otherwise renegotiated in writing. At the time, I told myself it was just insurance. I was younger then, paranoid, maybe even a little arrogant. But I'd seen too many engineers get gutted, walked out with nothing while the suits kept cashing in. So I wrote myself a lifeline and forgot about it until now. I flipped through the yellowing pages. There it was. Section 2B, neatly typed, signed by the original CTO, HR, and me, before Bryce, before the VC buyout, before the glossy rebrand and the downtown office with kombucha on tap. My hands were steady as I took a fresh scan and encrypted a copy to my personal cloud. I printed a hard duplicate and tucked it into the sleeve of my leather folio, right between my notebook and a gel pen sharp enough to draw blood. But I won't lie. That night, lying in bed with the light off and the ceiling fan clicking like a countdown clock, my mind wouldn't shut up. I kept hearing Bryce's voice in my head, smug, performative, kind of voice that thinks charisma can out-negotiate facts. I thought about Kelsey's frozen smile HR scripts, about Harold's half-lidded gaze and the company's lawyer budget. They had the numbers, the board, the PR team. I had one clause, one dry paragraph in a document no one had read in years, but it was airtight and more importantly, it was signed. The next morning I dressed carefully. Buttoned blouse, flat shoes, neutral colors, no jewelry, no drama. I looked like someone going to a dentist appointment, not someone about to drop a legal hand grenade on their employer. As I walked into the building, I passed Mason in the hallway. He didn't meet my eyes, just muttered something about pivoting user flow dependencies and kept walking like he had a halo of LinkedIn endorsements shielding him from karma. I took the elevator alone, floor 7, executive wing. I had 10 minutes to wait, so I sat. I opened my notebook, and I reread section 2B one more time. By the time the door opened and Bryce's cologne hit me like a trust fund in aerosol form, I was ready. I didn't feel fear. I felt loaded, like a spring, like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. Let them try to cut me loose. I'd built the foundation of this place, and I'd written the fine print that was about to crack it wide open. The conference room smelled like ambition and printer toner. One wall was glass, probably so they could watch people's dreams die in high definition. I walked in, gave a polite nod to Kelsey, who looked like she'd been practicing her we care face in the mirror, and took the seat furthest from the door. Bryce was already there, lounging like he owned the oxygen in the room. Harold the lawyer shuffled in last, carrying a tablet like it might attack him. He gave me the kind of glance you give to an empty water bottle, annoyance with a hint of guilt. Bryce didn't even say good morning. He went straight into his little Broadway show. So he said, clasping his hands like a bad pastor, "This isn't easy, but it's necessary." I stared at him. He smiled like I should clap. "It's not personal," he continued. "Just a realignment of strategic priorities. The board's vision is evolving. We need to stay nimble, lean, competitive." He used all the buzzwords, every last one. I counted 11 in under 60 seconds. He was speedrunning corporate nonsense like there was a prize at the end. Kelsey nodded every few seconds like her neck was spring-loaded. He gestured to a printed folder, slid it across the table like he was offering me a sandwich. "Severance package is generous," he said, like he was doing me a favor. 2 months, and you'll sign the standard IP reaffirmation doc, of course. Just a formality. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I folded my hands neatly on the table. He waited. The pause grew awkward. Kelsey jumped in. "We appreciate your contributions. This just isn't a reflection of performance, it's structural." I raised one eyebrow. "Is that what you told Aaron when you cut his team last week?" Kelsey blinked. Bryce frowned. "We're not here to rehash past decisions," Bryce said. "Let's focus on moving forward." I said nothing. Bryce leaned back, that smug lean, like he was posing for his future memoir's dust jacket. "You've been a valuable part of our evolution," he said, clearly enjoying his own voice, but systems change. "And frankly, our current IP policy doesn't leave much room for ambiguity." I wrote it myself after the acquisition. It's airtight. My heart thudded once, heavy but slow. That was the moment. The air in the room shifted, but I didn't. He smiled again. The kind of smile that said, "I win." The kind that usually worked on people who didn't know where the bodies were buried or who buried them. Kelsey slid the signature page toward me. "If you're ready, we can wrap this up today." I looked down at the document, then up at Harold. The lawyer hadn't said a word yet, probably thought this was open and shut. A routine Friday firing before brunch. I finally spoke. "Bryce," I said, tone flat, "when exactly did you write the IP policy?" He blinked. "Years ago, right after the merger." "Legal signed off." "Why?" I nodded slowly. "Just wondering if you read the original one." He laughed, actually laughed. "We sunset that dinosaur ages ago. The new one supersedes it." I murmured, "except where it doesn't." Now Harold looked up. I pulled out the folder. The original IP policy. The one with signatures. The one with dates. The one with section 2B tucked neatly in the middle like a buried landmine. "I'm going to need you to take a look at page 4, I said, sliding it across to Harold. Section 2B. Harold frowned, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. Kelsey's smile faltered. Bryce just scoffed and looked at his watch. And me? I sat there with my rage folded into neat corners. I watched their confidence like it was a sandcastle, and I just pointed at the tide. No raised voice, no threats, just paper and ink, let them keep talking. I didn't realize yet, but I wasn't the one being terminated. Not really, they were. The silence in the room had started to sweat. Bryce, still trying to ride the wave of his imagined authority, smirked and leaned back farther in his chair, arms crossed like he was about to explain blockchain to a barista. Listen, he said, we don't have to drag this out. The policy is clean. Legals reviewed it top to bottom. You're protected. We're protected. It's done. Kelsey gave a chipper little nod like she was about to ask if I wanted a bag for my belongings. I tilted my head, slow and steady. You mind if I see a copy? Bryce snorted, actually snorted. What, the current IP policy? I didn't blink, that's the one. He shrugged like I'd just asked to borrow a stapler. Knock yourself out. He plucked a glossy binder from Harold's bag without asking, flipped through a few pages like he was reading a brunch menu, and slid it across the table. The weight of it landed with a soft thud. I didn't touch it right away, let the moment stretch. Let the lawyer's eyes flick from the folder to me and back again. Then slowly I opened the binder. I didn't flip casually. I turned directly to page 4, no hesitation, like I'd memorized the feel of the paper from a lifetime ago. Section 2B, not his 2B, mine, because what Bryce didn't know, and what Kelsey and Harold had clearly never bothered to check, was that the post-merger version of the policy wasn't airtight. It was copy-pasted. Sloppily. With placeholder language carried over from the original. My original. And Section 2B was still there. Right there in black and white. In the event of termination without cause, intellectual property rights to any proprietary system authored, developed, and maintained solely by the employee shall revert to said employee, unless otherwise renegotiated in writing. I placed my index finger on the clause, firm, still. Harold leaned forward. At first he was just humoring me, probably assuming I was misreading it, some kind of employee morale clause with no teeth. But then his brow furrowed. He adjusted his glasses. His lips started moving as he read it again. And then again. Bryce was halfway through some dismissive joke, something about clinging to legacy code or boomer paranoia, and Harold made a noise. It wasn't loud, just a small, involuntary exhale, like someone realizing they'd just bet the house on the wrong horse. Wait a second, Harold muttered. Bryce paused. What? Harold didn't answer right away. He turned the page, then flipped back again. He checked the footnotes, the signature line, the date. And then he looked at me, not like a lawyer looking at an employee, like a man realizing there was a trapdoor under his chair the whole time. And I just pulled the lever. You said this was from the original version? He asked, voice a little too tight. I nodded. 2014. Signed by the original CTO and head of legal. It's in your document management system. You should be able to verify it. Kelsey's face had gone still. Her smile was gone, replaced by something brittle and frightened. Bryce chuckled. Okay, come on. That clause wouldn't survive an updated policy. We rewrote the whole thing. I tilted my head again. You reused the formatting, Bryce. Your rewrite left most of the framework intact, including the legal riders. You didn't supersede the old policy, you updated it and never revoked this clause, which means Harold cut me off, which means it's still valid. He looked down again, visibly sweating now. Bryce's smirk twitched. That can't be right. Harold didn't respond. He was already flipping backward, hunting for more landmines, and me. I just leaned back in my chair and folded my hands neatly in my lap, because the first crack had formed, and they hadn't even heard the rest of the ice breaking yet. Harold's finger was trembling slightly as it hovered over the clause, like he was afraid touching the ink would set off a legal bomb. He reread it again, this time out loud, under his breath, as if saying it softly might make it less real. Kelsey leaned in over his shoulder, her perfume hitting the air like panic in citrus form. She squinted at the paper, lips pursed, eyes scanning the line with the same expression people get when the GPS says they've driven into a lake. Bryce didn't move. Then, classic Bryce, he leaned forward, elbows on the table like he was about to call a bluff on poker night. Okay, slow down, he said, voice sharp with forced calm. We've updated this policy multiple times since 2014. That clause is outdated. Irrelevant. Harold didn't even look up. It's not. What do you mean it's not? Bryce snapped. Harold finally raised his head. He looked pale, like he'd just realized the cruise ship had been sinking for the last half hour and they'd sold the lifeboats. It's not outdated, he said, slower this time. This clause, Section 2B, was never rescinded, never overridden by a later agreement, and still carries the original signatures. Because we never issued a formal revocation or required employees to re-sign under new terms, he paused, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, then said it. She's right. This clause means she owns it. If she's terminated without cause, full intellectual property rights to any proprietary system she solely developed revert to her. Kelsey gasped. Bryce just blinked. Silence. Not the awkward kind, not even the angry kind. This was something worse. Recognition. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone realizes the car has already gone off the cliff and they're arguing about seatbelt etiquette midair. I didn't say a word, didn't smirk, didn't move. I just kept my finger on the clause. Bryce looked like he wanted to argue. His mouth opened, then closed. Opened again. He stared at Harold like he was trying to Jedi mind trick him into changing his mind. But there's no way that clause would stand in court, he said, but it was weaker now, uncertain. Harold didn't blink. It's enforceable. It was enforceable 10 years ago. It's enforceable now. Kelsey finally found her voice. Could we, maybe, renegotiate? Harold gave her a look like she'd asked if duct tape fixes lawsuits, not without exposure. That word, exposure, hung in the air like a wasp you don't want to swat. Bryce pushed back from the table hard. His chair screeched across the floor like a scream on linoleum. Okay, he muttered. Okay, so what's the play? Buy her out, bury it in legal? What are we talking here? Harold looked at me. But now it wasn't condescension in his eyes, it was respect and just a hint of dread. I don't know what we're talking, he said carefully. That depends entirely on her. Everyone turned to me. The woman they had expected to walk in, nod politely, sign the dotted line, disappear like a well-behaved ghost. But now they were seeing me clearly, and I let them sit in that silence. Because silence, when you control the terms, is power, and I'd earned every decibel of it. Bryce wasn't blinking anymore. He looked like someone had yanked the Ethernet cable out of his brain mid-update. The air that once puffed up his chest was now leaking out of him in wheezes and half-finished thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said, throat dry. How does this even still exist? Legal reviewed all this, didn't they? He was looking at Harold like a man begging the weather not to rain. Harold didn't even flinch. Just closed the folder gently, the same one he'd practically flung at me 40 minutes ago like it was a prop in a play he thought he'd written. It was no longer a prop, it was an obituary. Well, Harold said flatly, clearly legal didn't read everything, or they assumed the language was overwritten. But the signature trail is clean. The clause is active. It's not vague, it's not buried, it's just there. Kelsey turned a shade of white I'd only ever seen on expired yogurt. She started whispering, loud enough for everyone to hear we're exposed. This is a liability event. This could trigger clawbacks. This affects every vendor touchpoint if her code's under reversion. She flipped through her notes, hands shaking. Our SOC2 cert references her audit trails. Our investor deck outlines proprietary tech based on her stack. Our pitch decks use her language verbatim. Her voice cracked. We're not just talking severance here. This is ownership. Bryce wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his stupid performance fleece. Okay, calm down. Everyone just breathe. This is fixable. We just need to offer her something reasonable. His eyes finally met mine. But now the bravado was gone. The swagger, the lean, the trademark MBA smirk, all of it melted into something that looked suspiciously like fear wearing a mask made of charm. He tried. He really did. You're a smart person, he said like it was a favor. Obviously you don't want this to become adversarial. Think about what we've built together, I said, the single word slicing the air like a scalpel. He flinched. I turned to Harold. I wanted him to say it. I wanted them all to hear it one more time. Out loud, formal, final. He adjusted his collar, pushed the folder gently across the table toward me, and said in a voice that no longer carried even a whisper of doubt. She holds ownership over the system's architecture, backend structure, and deployment pipeline. Under Clause 2B, termination without cause triggers automatic reversion of intellectual property rights to the original creator, provided no superseding agreement was signed. And he paused. None was, he exhaled long and low, then looked me dead in the eye. What would it take, he asked carefully, to resolve this quietly? The phrase hung in the room like smoke from a fire they thought was out. I didn't answer right away. I took the folder, opened it, smoothed the page with the back of my hand like it was a favorite photograph. I looked at the three of them. The HR rep who had giggled behind my back during culture fit reviews, the director who tried to erase my legacy with a PowerPoint and a buzzword, and the lawyer who hadn't even glanced at the old IP files until it was too late. They all thought I'd be desperate. They thought I'd be grateful for table scraps. But now they were the ones squirming under fluorescent lights, and me, I was just beginning to enjoy the view. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Let the tension stretch until it hummed. My hands folded neatly in front of me, not shaking, not clenched, just still. They waited, three of them across the table, each unraveling in their own private way. Kelsey tapping her pen like a telegraph machine wired to anxiety. Harold staring at a point on the wall that didn't exist. And Bryce had gone very, very quiet. I looked at him last. The same man who'd walked into this building like a golden retriever with a startup pitch deck, who'd called my work legacy garbage, who'd laughed when I'd asked for access to my own server tools. He wasn't laughing now. His voice, when it finally crawled up out of his throat, was ragged. Look, maybe we can be reasonable. Nobody wants a lawsuit. Nobody wants bad press. You've made your point. I tilted my head slow. No, Bryce, I haven't. Silence. Then I spoke, not loud, not angry, just surgical. I'm not here to beg for severance. I slid the IP document gently back toward Harold. He didn't touch it, just stared at it like it was a snake coiled under glass. I'm not here to sign anything or to negotiate a quiet exit. That ship sailed when you tried to write me out of my own work with a copy-paste policy and a LinkedIn certification in arrogance. I glanced at Kelsey, and I'm not interested in whatever goodwill script HR is about to offer. No thank you for your service parade. No plaque. No hollow promises about references. Finally, I locked eyes with Bryce. I own the foundation of your company. You want it back? I leaned in slightly. You'll pay. Harold opened his mouth, closed it. then finally gave the tiniest nod, stiff, reluctant, but unmistakable. It was the first honest gesture I'd seen from him since I walked into the room. "What's the number?" he asked quietly. I gave them a figure, not outrageous, not petty, but big enough to sting, big enough to matter, big enough to fund 6 months off and a private contract with their largest competitor if I chose to go that route. Bryce made a noise like he'd swallowed a paperclip. Kelsey's pen finally stilled. Harold didn't flinch. "I'll have it drafted," he said, and that was it. The meeting didn't end with yelling or slammed doors or threats. It ended with a single page left on the table, still warm from my fingers. As I stood to leave, Bryce said nothing. His hands were flat on the table, his eyes somewhere down in the wood grain, as if trying to tunnel out of the room without having to see me again. I paused at the door. Not to gloat, not to taunt, just to breathe. 10 years of quiet work. 10 years of watching louder, less capable people collect credit like coupons. 10 years of building something beautiful, only to be told I was too hard to manage. Turns out the hardest thing to manage was losing control of your own company's soul to the woman you underestimated. And I didn't even have to raise my voice. I just wrote a clause and waited. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit 'em.